Well, welcome. My name is Mary Morgan. I'm a member of Main Street Moms. And the first thing I want to do is indicate that we are very pleased to offer Spanish interpretation services. And Nora Goodfriend-Coven is going to be doing the interpreting. I'm very glad to welcome members of our Latinx community. Nora?
Hola, buenas tardes, bienvenidos a todos. Se les ofrece interpretación al español por mi parte, Nora Goodfriend-Coven. Y tenemos audífonos y pueden usar audífonos para oír y yo voy a estar sentada atrás para la comunidad Latinx. Y maybe I should say silence cell phones. Y y si pueden, por favor, apagar su teléfono celular, si es que lo tiene prendido. Ahorita ella lo va a repetir al inglés.
Thanks, Mara. So, welcome. We are thrilled that you all have taken the time to come and join us together to talk about this very important issue. And on behalf of Point Reyes Books, KWMR, our wonderful local radio station, and Main Street Moms, we want to welcome everyone to this conversation we don't usually have about housing segregation. Some of you may be surprised by what you hear. Some of it may be old news to you. Some of it may be hard to hear. Please listen with open hearts and open minds and engage your curiosity. Our goals moving forward are to work together to end past housing discrimination, remedy the impact of that discrimination, and challenge the current racial disparities created by segregation. I want to welcome our friends from Marin City and East Marin. Thank you for all the work that you do. And a special shout out to our wonderful supervisor, Dennis Redoni. Dennis, thank you for taking the time to be here. We will have questions at the end of the interview. There are blank cards on your chairs. Please use those to write down your questions and write them as they occur to you during the interview. As you write them, there will be people on the outside of the rows to pick up your questions. Please don't wait until the very end so that we have a glut of questions. Write them down. They'll be picked up. Hi, Morgan. They'll be picked up as we go through our program, and they will all be asked at the end. Now, I just said all, and I didn't mean to say that. We probably won't have time to answer all of the questions, but we will collect them all, and all of them will be given to Leah so that she can see the different areas of interest and questions that you have. The program is being recorded by KWMR. Thank you all very much, James and Amanda. And it is being filmed by Marin TV. It will be available on Marin TV's YouTube channel. Please make sure we have your email address so that we can keep you informed about further events and send you the link to the recordings. If you haven't already given us your email address, there are sign-up sheets and clipboards in the lobby as you leave. There's also a handout on your chair. Please take a look at it. Please take it home to remind yourselves of this event and the questions you may have had about what we're going to talk about. And we hope that you will use it for continued conversation. The typical housekeeping rules: turn off your cell phones, please. Bathrooms are out that double door and to the right, and there's also water in the lobby. So I know it's hot. We have as many windows and doors open as we can. So, on to the main event. Our guest today is Leah Rothstein, And she is the co-author with Richard Rothstein of Just Action. And I'm so glad to see that so many of you have purchased the book. And hopefully those of you who didn't, you have already read it or you've seen it someplace else. Leah is a housing policy consultant. She has worked with nonprofit housing developers, cities and counties, redevelopment agencies, and private firms on community development and affordable housing policy, practice, and finance. She's also worked as a community organizer, focused on issues of environmental justice, public safety, youth leadership, and housing. Welcome, Leah. Thank you so much for coming to West Marin to help us initiate this hard conversation about housing segregation and what we can do about it. So, to just jump right in, and I'm going to take a seat because I'm told that I'm supposed to be like a talk show host, so that's what I'll do. So, there's a great deal of talk across California and really across the entire country about the housing crisis. We don't have enough housing. We don't have enough of the right kind of housing. We don't have enough affordable housing. But we don't have much conversation about housing segregation and its relationship to the housing shortage. We think of housing segregation as something like a relic of the past. What exactly is housing segregation? How did it come about? And is it still with us?
Starting with the easy questions. Well, I think we all recognize that we live in a racially segregated society. Our country, every metropolitan area, is segregated by race, especially the segregation of whites and African Americans. It has been persistent and has changed very little since the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, which prohibited the discrimination, racial discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. So even with that outlawed, the blatant discrimination in the sale and rental of housing, segregation still persists. And we have come to accept as a country an explanation for that segregation, which we call de facto segregation. We tell ourselves that it's different than the laws that segregated the South, that required racial segregation in buses and lunch counters and schools. Those were required by law. But we tell ourselves that racial segregation of our communities is something different, that it's, it was private actors, realtors, landlords, mortgage brokers who refuse to sell or rent homes to African Americans and white communities, or it's personal choice that we just like to live around people who look like us, so we naturally sort into racially segregated communities. And so we look around and we think, it's too bad that we're separated like this, but anything that happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. There's nothing we can do about it. Well, basically that explanation for the segregation of our communities is a myth, the de facto segregation idea. And my dad, Richard Rothstein, wrote The Color of Law in 2017, and the whole premise of that book was proving that de facto segregation idea is nonsense. The whole book is filled with brutal examples of the government policy, all levels of government, local, state, federal government, that explicitly and intentionally required the racial segregation of our communities. And so even with the outlawing in discrimination that the Fair Housing Act did in 1968, it's one thing to say, we can no longer discriminate in who can sit at this lunch counter, then the next day anybody can sit at the lunch counter. But once we outlaw discrimination in housing, the patterns that were already set up by our government policies over decades that created racially segregated communities, even if you get rid of the blatant discrimination that occurred before the Fair Housing Act was passed, those patterns are really hard to undo without intentional action with the goal of undoing the racial segregation of our communities. So that's why we still see a racially segregated country, even though we think racial discrimination is a thing of the past. It doesn't just go away on its own unless we take intentional action to undo and challenge and redress it. And I'll just add one more piece to the sort of whole conversation is that, I think sometimes we think of racial segregation as or it's a danger to think of it as like just a benign separation of people, where some people choose to live in this neighborhood, some people choose to live in this neighborhood, so they all look alike in their neighborhoods. It's sort of benign and doesn't have an effect on the quality of their lives. But the same government policies that required the segregation of whites and blacks in our communities also made those white communities areas of high resources, of well-resourced schools and open space and clean air and grocery stores and banks. And the areas where African Americans were limited to living were deprived of resources. Less well-resourced public schools, closer to industry and highways with polluting, air, pollution in the air, more asthma, more higher rates of cancer for children who grow up in those communities. So these effects, the government policies that not only separated people, but then separated resources for the people who lived in those various types of communities, have long-term effects on our lives. They determine outcomes in terms of income, how much we earn throughout our lives, our educational outcomes, health outcomes, and how long we live. So it's not sort of a problem that doesn't have consequences or that doesn't matter. It actually it matters the most. It determines not just our quality of life, but how long we live. So it's not something that we can really ignore.
Thank you so much for connecting those dots. I confess that particularly when the COVID pandemic started and there was so much discussion about racial disparities in healthcare, I thought a lot about, well, it's the problem of the healthcare industry and how people of color, and especially African Americans, are treated by the healthcare industry, and their pain is not seen as significant, et cetera. But I must say, in reading your book, the connection of how important where we live is to all those other forms of disparities has been quite illuminating to me, and has given me a broader framework in which to think about all of those things. I'm wondering, in the same vein of connecting the dots, if you could talk with us a little bit about the connection between housing segregation and our current housing shortage. Did segregation bring about this shortage? And are there some remedies for the housing shortage that will be more effective than others in mitigating housing segregation?
Yeah, so I would say these are overlapping issues, the lack of housing in general and housing segregation, and I'll give an example. So, we used to, in this country, okay, I'll back up for a second. So zoning, we're all familiar a little bit with zoning. It's how a local government determines what land use can be used where. It's a purely local policy, says this area can have residential use, this industrial, commercial, et cetera. So back in the early 1900s, it was allowed and practiced that jurisdictions could zone by race, that they could make residential zones for whites only, for blacks only. And that was one way that the government created segregated communities. Then that became illegal to zone by race. And so because people still wanted, local governments, state governments still wanted to create and maintain segregated communities, what took the place of racial zoning was single-family zoning. So communities that allow only single-family homes to be built on, so every lot can only have one home, is effectively capping the number of homes that a community can have, which effectively ensures that those home prices will be high, because as demand goes up, the supply can't meet it, so the prices of those homes that exist will go up, without any opportunity for building more homes to meet the demand because of the zoning code. So communities all over the country have zoned most of their land for single-family only use. I think 75% of residentially zoned land in the country is single-family only allowed, which has led us to where we are today. So with the housing shortage, if you only allow one house per lot, we're, in 75% of the residentially zoned land in the country, we're capping the supply of housing and creating a housing crisis where we can't build enough housing to meet the demand. So the motivation behind single-family only zoning to ensure house prices stay high, and by ensuring those house prices stay high, you're pricing out anybody but the most affluent families. And because of the policies that allowed and subsidized, so now I'm layering all this history on here. I'll back up a bit. So after World War II, one of the major policies that the federal government employed to create segregated communities came about when the federal government decided to help suburbanize the country after World War II. We weren't a suburban economy at the time. Most people lived in urban centers because that's where their work was. Factories needed to be located near ports and rail lines. Millions of war veterans came home from the war, started families, we had the baby boom, and there was a housing shortage because of World War II, and before that, the Great Depression, not a lot of housing was built. So the federal government wanted to meet the demand for housing for these returning war veterans and their families and decided to help subsidize building suburbs all over the country. And in helping subsidize the suburban development of the country, the federal government, through the Federal Housing Administration, in written policy, said that developers who wanted to build a suburb or a subdivision could only get federal loan guarantees, federal subsidies, if they agreed to only sell the homes that they built to whites. So it was written in government policy, explicitly stated that we will suburbanize the country for whites only, so effectively creating white suburbs all over the country, and then those white families, veterans, could get VA mortgages, VA loans with no down payment. They could get Federal Housing Administration loans with low down payment requirements, so they were subsidized on the buying end and the building end, these suburban developments. African Americans explicitly prohibited from buying homes in these communities. So when these suburbs were created, the homes in these communities in suburbs all around the country, created with federal subsidies, they cost about $100,000 in today's money. It's hard to imagine in California a home in a suburb costing $100,000, but they did. That was what the families that could move into those homes paid for those homes. Then those homes appreciated in value to what we see today. 400,000, 500,000, $1 million or more in many suburbs around here, many communities around here. So the white families that could get into home ownership when it was affordable built wealth over generations through the accumulation and value of those homes that they could pass on to their kids to buy their own homes. While African Americans were explicitly prohibited through government policy from participating in home ownership when it was affordable, so prohibited from building up wealth the same way. So that's some background. We have now a wealth gap between blacks and whites that's staggering. Average household wealth of African American households is about 5% of average wealth of white households, due primarily to these government policies that allowed and helped white families build up wealth through home ownership and prohibited African Americans from doing the same. So now, fast forward to today, we have a suburban community that only allows single-family homes to be built there, so the homes are expensive. Who can afford to buy those homes? People who have intergenerational wealth to help pay for those homes and pay the down payments to buy into them. And so those communities remain white, and African Americans are effectively prohibited from buying into those expensive communities because of the accumulation of the consequences of the policies that created them to be segregated communities to begin with. So that's one way that the housing shortage and housing segregation sort of overlap on each other. And so a lot of communities around the country, both to meet the housing affordability crisis and some to address housing segregation, are looking to upzone their communities, so to outlaw single-family only zoning. California has done that, Oregon, and other local communities, local cities and counties are also looking at upzoning, outlawing single-family only zoning. It's a very important first step. If we can't build more housing, we can't have more affordable housing. Housing prices will just remain high and keep climbing if we can't build more housing to meet the demand. But even now, so in California, It requires that every lot can be subdivided into two, and each of those halves can build 2 units. So every lot can now, under law, jurisdictions have to allow 4 units per lot if builders and the lot owners want to do that. But so now there's 4 houses where one existed before. Likely they're probably less expensive because they're smaller units, but still it's probable that white families will move into those homes before African Americans will. They'll still outbid African American families who have less intergenerational wealth to place high bids on those houses. So if we really want to use upzoning and zoning reform as a tool for desegregation, we need to have additional intentional efforts to make those new units that are built accessible and prioritized for African American families or any families that have been historically excluded from that community to have access to those homes. So we, in Just Action, we argue very explicitly that we need race-specific solutions because the crimes of our government that created the reality that we live in today were race-specific. They weren't race-neutral policies, they were very race-specific, and so we can't remedy those policies with race-neutral solutions. So if we want any of these sort of housing reforms and efforts to be tools for desegregation, we need to have some race-specific solutions and priorities and preferences added onto them.
So I have to ask you at this point, excuse me, you know, the Supreme Court would differ with you. The Supreme Court is very anxious to say not only can we not have affirmative action, but race should not be considered in terms of people going to schools and a whole variety of other things. How can we persuade our political leaders who certainly don't want to get sued? How can we persuade them to adopt race-specific measures in the way that you're talking about?
Well, yeah, the Supreme Court would not agree, but the Supreme Court also says that the government had no role to play in creating segregation. So the Chief Justice John Roberts has written that in opinions over and over. So they have, we argue that we have to be courageous enough to not defer to a Supreme Court that is mistaken in its understanding of our history, and a Supreme Court that, except for a small 15-year period of the Warren Court, has not been a proponent of advancing racial equity and of interpreting the Constitution correctly when it comes to issues of racial inequality and racial equality. And so we have a whole chapter in Just Action called Dare to Defy, where we argue that those sort of in pursuit of racial justice, we too often defer to the Supreme Court, and we're afraid of what the Supreme Court will think if we are race-specific in our solutions. And we outline a lot of history about how the Supreme Court has flip-flopped in terms of how it's interpreted the Constitution when it comes to advancing racial equality. And so there's no reason we should sort of defer to their inconsistent interpretation when this is the correct thing to do. And I understand that having that courage and, potentially being sued is a high ask, it's a big ask, but it's not without precedent. The civil rights movement broke laws in order to advance civil rights and change our country. And a more recent example, in the abortion debate, when Roe v. Wade was the law of the Supreme Court, abortion opponents passed laws in defiance of Roe v. Wade because they believed that was the right thing to do, and they did it until that case law, they got sued, and then it rose to the Supreme Court and it was reversed with Dobbs. So we should be doing the same thing and advancing race-specific solutions to these race-specific crimes and being ready to, defend them in court. And if we're defeated, we build up, in those dissents that will support our opinions, we build up some case law that can be used to defend future actions. And I will say that there's a lot of sort of movement around this, around the country. This question comes up every time I speak about the book. Everyone around the country is afraid of doing this, is worried that the Supreme Court will strike down what we're doing. But there are a lot of communities doing it anyway. And I would say that the most effective way to do it is to base our solutions on the history that we're solving for. If we base the race-specific remedies on the race-specific crimes that we're remedying for, it's a lot harder to defeat legally. So one example, a recently passed law in Washington State called the Covenant Homeownership Act. It was passed in April after, the first time it was introduced in the Washington State legislature, it was passed. After the people around the state, volunteers, did research and uncovered 50,000 racially restrictive covenants on deeds of homes, on homes around the state. So these are the covenants that were written into deeds that say that the home can only ever be owned or occupied by whites. No longer legally enforceable, but they remain on the deeds until some legal action takes them off. So they did this research and found 50,000 of these racially restrictive covenants. And there's more, they're not done looking. But that helped build up the argument that the government had a role to play in remedying this race-specific harm. And so they passed this law that puts a $100 fee on every real estate transaction that funds the program. And then they have to do a study to determine the exact specifics of the program, but the funds collected through that fee will go towards people who were harmed by those racially restrictive covenants to help them with down payments. And by tying it to that specific harm, it's very hard to argue that being race-specific is illegal. And there's actually authority under the Special Purpose Credit Program that allows race-specific financial tools like down payment assistance or mortgage assistance, allows them to be race-specific. If a study is conducted and can show that this group has suffered a discrimination or a racially specific harm from the financial industry. This has been an authority by the federal government since 1976. So it's only recently being used because jurisdictions and banks are only recently having the courage to do it. Hasn't yet been challenged in court. So it's possible, and basing it on the specific history, I think, is the way we need to proceed.
So I think one of the really wonderful things about your book and the network that you are creating and expanding through your blog on the Substack, and there's a link to that on your handout, is bringing all of this information that otherwise we wouldn't get. It doesn't make the national media. The New York Times isn't particularly concerned about dealing with housing segregation these days, nor is, our local media. But I think in bringing together people and ideas that we wouldn't ordinarily think about is a really wonderful and very important thing that you're doing. And I want to also thank you for encouraging us and reminding us that we can defy things. We don't have to slavishly follow laws that are not proper laws. We can stand up and do the right thing and be courageous. And we don't always have to be afraid of being sued. And I think we need to really remember that, because we're here to do the right thing, not to just be at the right place at the right time. So let me come a little closer to home. Marin City is a very small geographic area in unincorporated Marin, and it's the scene of much controversy right now because a developer wants to build a very large affordable housing project there. And, it's sort of housing at all costs. Here's a development, we need housing, they should build it. Marin City residents are very proud of their large affordable housing community. There's a great deal of it in Marin City. But most residents oppose this particular housing development because Marin City already has more housing density and more affordable housing than any other area in unincorporated Marin. So I'm wondering if you could comment on the impact of concentrating affordable housing where there's already affordable housing? And does that move us toward dismantling housing segregation, or does it exacerbate it?
Yeah, that's a good question. This is where sort of the overlap of the housing shortage and segregation don't overlap. Is that how that works? Yes, we need more affordable housing in Marin County and in every county in California. By concentrating all of the affordable housing in areas where low-income people are already concentrated, we're further segregating, we're continuing to perpetuate and maintain the segregation of our communities. That's the simple, short answer. So this has been government policy for a long time to concentrate low-income housing, public housing in low-income communities and ensure that all low-income people live in the same neighborhood, and then those neighborhoods and areas are deprived of resources. They become, what we think of as slums, or, they don't have regular trash pickup. They don't have access to transportation and jobs. They're overly policed. So all of these policies that start with the concentration of poverty are what then continue to perpetuate and feed into the ongoing consequences of segregating our communities. So what we need to do to desegregate places like Marin County is build affordable housing in all parts of the county and ensure that there's housing that's affordable to a full range of households in every part of the county. That means low-income subsidized housing, and it means housing affordable to middle-income households. I think it's dangerous and a big mistake we make sort of in the housing community in this country, talking about affordable housing and desegregation, that affordable housing or low income and African American is the same thing. Most African American families are not low income. They fall into this middle income category of households, which also can't find affordable housing, particularly in California, but growingly more across the country, where they make too much to qualify for subsidized low-income housing and too little to afford market rate housing. And there's not a lot of public subsidy for building middle-income housing, which is one reason why upzoning is a important tool towards building middle-income housing, because if you have a community, say like here, I don't know the zoning code here, I imagine it's mostly single-family only zoned. If you build, townhouses on a lot instead of one big house, they're likely to be cheaper than that big house. So that starts to meet the need for middle-income households for lower cost housing. So that's one piece of the puzzle. The other piece is building subsidized low-income housing in all parts of our communities and ensuring that they're not concentrated together in the same areas. And I'll say that there's local decisions around this, the approvals for the project, any subsidies that the local government provides to low-income subsidized housing. There's also a piece on the state level. Now, we in Just Action focus very specifically on local issues and what we can do locally to begin to dismantle and challenge segregation in our own communities. But there is something local residents can organize to advocate on the state level for what it's called the Qualified Action Plan, which helps jurisdictions like counties and cities decide how to use, or it helps the state decide how to use its low-income housing tax credits, which is the biggest public subsidy for building low-income housing, is the low-income housing tax credit. This Qualified Action Plan, it determines which projects will receive a tax credit allocation and which won't through a complicated point scoring system. But projects, here's an example of how this Qualified Action Plan creates and continues to perpetuate segregation and concentration of poverty. So one piece in most QAPs that gives points to a prospective project, and because tax credits are there's a scarcity of tax credits. Basically, any proposal that wants to get an allocation needs the maximum point amount possible in the scoring system. And so you get points if you can demonstrate local support for your project. Now, I think we can all probably guess that most, exclusive suburban communities are unlikely to come out in support for a low-income housing tax credit subsidized low-income project. So if the development can't demonstrate that support, it doesn't get its maximum points, and it's unlikely to get the tax credit allocations. So this is a way built into the government's allocation of subsidies for subsidized housing for low-income people, that it basically ensures that this housing will only be built in areas of, that already have lower-income people who are less likely to oppose the projects. So this is something we can do on the state level. There's public comment every time the qualified action plan is approved. We can, as organized residents of our community, weigh in on that process. And we can also work to ensure that when projects are proposed, like the one in Marin City, we show up to the Planning Commission and advocate that it is built in a different part of the county, for example, and show the support that exists in those communities where we don't necessarily expect to find that support, that we organize to build it, to build the support and grow it and bring those projects to higher opportunity, more affluent parts of counties.
So I think one of the things you're saying here is that we need to be concerned about the entire area in which we live. And it's about where, it's not just, is housing going to be built here or not be built here, but it's looking at the entire area. And if we want to have more balanced resources, more balanced neighborhoods, both in terms of race and economics and opportunity, we need to care about a larger area than just our backyard. So, and I do want to give a shout out to Friends of Golden Gate Village, which Golden Gate Village, for those of you who don't know, is a public housing project, the only large family public housing project in Marin. It's located in Marin City. And a number of people in Marin formed Friends of Golden Gate Village to support the residents of that housing project, to have a revitalization plan that supported the values and the needs and desires of the people who live there. And so to me, this is a wonderful example of caring about your neighbors, caring about what happens to them, where they live, and the impact of where they live. It's a really important thing to do. So speaking of where you live, in your book you talk primarily about the impact of housing discrimination on African Americans. As you may see from our audience here, we do have some people from our Latinx community, and I'm wondering what you say about the housing discrimination suffered by the Latinx community.
So certainly African Americans are not the only group who's experience housing discrimination and whose, the consequences of that discrimination also deserves remedies and solutions. As I said before about being race-specific in our solutions, we argue for being very specific about what the crimes are that we're remedying for. And the ones that we've focused on, my dad in The Color of Law and us in Just Action, are the very explicit crimes of the government in segregating African Americans and discriminating against African Americans in housing. So that discrimination requires and obligates us to have solutions and remedies to that have to be specific to the policies of the government that were specifically targeted to African Americans. Now, it's not to say that the solutions, many of the solutions we discuss in Just Action will also benefit the Latinx community, and they should, and that's good. But we also should be specific about, the segregation and the discrimination that the Latinx community has suffered should have specific solutions that might be different than the ones that are solving for the discrimination suffered by African Americans. And when we try to lump it all together, we are less successful in remedying the specific harms that were perpetuated. So we advocate for being very specific in what we're remedying and for whom. And, if there's another book around the segregation of the Latinx community, I haven't heard of it, but I would love to see it, or someone should write it. But that's not what we focused on here.
Thank you. We have some very active land trusts, community land trusts here in Marin, two of which are located in West Marin, CLAM, the Community Land Trust of West Marin, and the Bolinas Land Trust. Their explicit mission is to preserve affordable housing and even some commercial property. So for instance, in terms of providing housing for the people who maybe make too much to have subsidizing housing, but not enough to buy market rate housing. CLAM has been very busy in the past few years, as have many people in this audience, in terms of renovating 54 units in a former Coast Guard facility that's just a stone's throw from here. And the whole point of having the Coast Guard facility is not only to provide affordable housing, but also to provide housing for workforce, for people who work here, who commute here, and who see West Marin as their home. So I'm wondering if you could speak to other ways that community land trusts can be used as a tool specifically to dismantle housing segregation.
Sure. Do we all generally understand how a land trust creates affordable housing? I could give a little explanation. Some nods. Okay. So a land trust acquires land. Land trusts are often nonprofits. Their goal is to create permanently affordable home ownership opportunities. That's often the common goal of land trusts. And they do that by acquiring land. Like I imagine the Coast Guard facility was maybe donated to the land trust.
Oh, no.
No?
No.
Okay. Or they buy it.
The federal government, thanks to our congressperson, the federal government sold it to the county, which the county did buy, and it has then selected CLAM and Eden as the developers for that.
Okay, great. So that's one way it happens. Often land trusts get vacant or unused land through their local government. And then they build or renovate the homes on it and sell those homes at affordable prices to lower moderate income households. And they can sell them at affordable prices because the land trust retains ownership of the land underneath the house. So rising cost of land is one of the primary drivers of the rising cost of housing. So if you take the land out of the equation, the house is more affordable. So the homeowner then of a land trust home, they like ground lease the land from the land trust for maybe $1 a year, something negligible. And they own the home like any other homeowner, and they pay their taxes and insurance and mortgage. And then when they want to resell the home, the land trust has a maximum resale price that they establish based on a formula which varies by land trust. But usually those formulas try to achieve two things. One is to allow the home selling family to earn some equity in the sale of the home. It's a limited equity arrangement, so it's not as much as if they sold it on market prices, because they want to limit that equity that the seller earns so that the price is affordable to the next home buyer. So it's not the only solution to housing segregation, but it's an important one because it creates permanently affordable home ownership, which is really difficult to do without, or impossible to do without this resale restriction. And there are a lot of land trusts that operate in like gentrifying communities where land prices are rising, and the land trust will acquire land and sell them at affordable prices, and it's a great tool for preventing some displacement that can occur in those gentrifying communities as the longtime residents of those communities are priced out by the rising cost of housing. So that's a way, main way that land trusts do help promote desegregation by ensuring that lower income, predominantly African American or Latino community is not just flipped to all white as it gentrifies, ensuring that there's some affordable housing opportunity that remains perpetually affordable in those communities. Now in places like here where it's not an issue where it's a segregated African American community that's gentrifying, but in order for the land trust here to be, for their homes to be tools of desegregation, there need to be intentional efforts to ensure that the people who get to live in those land trust homes will or maybe people who've been historically excluded from the community, maybe those who are excluded by restrictive covenants that existed in Marin prior, or people who work in the, the industries, service industries, workforce, they call it workforce, who are priced out of living here to begin with. So these are all workarounds to being race specific, and I know I argue emphatically for being race specific in the preferences, but sometimes people and organizations use workarounds because they're not quite ready to be race specific in their solutions. And some of the workarounds, they're not as effective as being explicit about who should access that housing, but they can work. So one that is sort of gets closest to targeting African American households is targeting, instead of first-time homebuyers, first-generation homebuyers. So people who, whose parents didn't own homes, and so those are more likely to be African Americans than first-time homebuyers. It sort of narrows the field a little bit, and that's being used around the country to try to get at remedying the wealth gap that exists between blacks and whites because of ongoing segregation and discrimination, without being race specific in who should access that benefit. So that's a way that a land trust here could be explicit about ensuring that their homes are a tool for desegregating the community.
Thank you. I want to remind folks, if you have questions, use the blank cards to write them down, pass them out to the outer edges of your rows, and folks will pick them up. Leah, you spoke about upzoning, single-family zoning, racially exclusive zoning. What is inclusionary zoning, and why is it important?
Yeah, inclusionary zoning is also adopted through the local government, through the local zoning code. And it's a requirement that when new housing is built in a community, that a certain percentage of the units that are built have to be preserved as affordable to lower or moderate income households. So often in areas that are gentrifying and there's a lot of new market rate housing being built, it's a good way of ensuring that there is some permanently affordable, if the law requires them to be permanently affordable, which it should, that some new affordable housing is built in those gentrifying areas as well to ensure that the people who are being priced out of the community have some access to affordable housing. It also is a great tool for producing affordable housing that doesn't rely on government funding and subsidies to build the housing because the costs are borne by the developer. And it's basically a cost to do business in a community with an inclusionary zoning law. It's like, if I build in this community, it has this amount of permitting requirements and costs, and this amount of, I have to build this many parking spaces, and I have to build this many inclusionary units. So it's just sort of incorporated into the cost of building in that community and provides a huge public or benefit for lower and moderate income households that the cost is borne by a developer. Now, it's what do they say? The devil is in the details. So how that law is written is very important. If the requirement on the developer is too high, it's true, they won't build housing. It will cost too much, then it'll be more than they will earn to sell or rent that housing, and so they will stop building. So that's why to have an inclusionary zoning ordinance, a community really needs to do an economic analysis to understand what that threshold is, where they can, what's the maximum they can require in terms of inclusionary requirements without making it too onerous that a developer will stop building. And I understand that the ordinance here is being revised, and I looked at it a little bit, and it seems like, from what I understand, my brief reading of it, it's lowering the percent requirement of how many units are required, but it's making them a range. So you can provide fewer units if they're sort of lower affordability, so because that's more expensive for the developer. And you have to provide more units if they're higher, so like low or moderate income units, you have to provide more units than if they're very low income units, you can provide fewer units. And that makes sense because that allows a developer to decide what mix they want to provide, while also encouraging or requiring that the community gets new very low-income units and low-income units, which is very hard to produce without public subsidy, those very low-income units. So that's important. There's other details of inclusionary zoning laws that can make or break them in terms of being effective at producing affordable housing and preventing segregation or challenging segregation. And that is, some communities allow developers, instead of building the affordable units, to pay a fee. Often that fee is not high enough to build a unit, so it's kind of a cop-out for the developer that doesn't then provide the units that the jurisdiction is wanting out of that policy. So it's important to set that fee at the right amount. Other times, the policies allow developers to build the affordable units off-site in another development, which also doesn't further the goals of integrated housing and economically integrated communities. However, I did notice in Marin County's revisions that it requires, if they build them off-site, has to be in the same, I think, census tract, or in I forget the word they use, but basically a affluent sort of area of high opportunity, which is I think a good piece to, if they're gonna allow it off-site, it can't then be where they build all the affordable units in Marin City, but they have to build those affordable units in an equally sort of affluent area of the county.
So I think this discussion about inclusionary zoning is a really good example of housing policy is multi-layered and it is very complicated. Don't be daunted, which I think is another lesson from Just Action. You don't have to be an expert, and correct me if I'm wrong, Leah, but I got the message, you don't have to be an expert. There are a lot of experts out there, and actually what Golden Gate Village did was a wonderful example of having a vision of what they wanted to do that was so good that it attracted experts on a pro bono basis to come and give them all of the factual stuff that they needed in order to produce a plan for approval by the Board of Supervisors. So I want to say again, this is about what we can do. We need to understand the problem. We need to connect the dots and realize how important it is that where we live determines so many other aspects of our lives and the generations to come after us. It's not just one home in a neighborhood. It will, it creates or doesn't create this wealth divide. And that we can find resources we need to do important things. We're getting close to the time we want to end, but I do want to, we've talked a lot about what governments do. And the color of law obviously put a lot of emphasis on how government created and perpetuated housing segregation. But obviously, private companies such as realtors, banks, developers have also played an important role. They didn't create the whole bad bag, but they certainly have contributed a good part of it. You have such an interesting chapter in your book about holding them accountable. And are there ways of holding private actors, such as banks, such as realtors, such as title companies, holding them accountable for their role in creating and perpetuating housing segregation?
Yeah. Well, I'll just start by saying, so the color of law focused on government's role in creating segregation, and Just Action really focuses on our role as residents of our communities in undoing and challenging it. So I've been talking a lot about government policy, just to understand what we can do and advocate for as residents of our community and demand that our government change or implement or enact in order to begin to challenge and remedy segregation. So it's really on us to do this. And it's on us to require that our government enact these policies and to require that our local institutions and companies and corporations live up to their obligation to remedy the segregation that they help to create. So while the federal government, like the example I gave in the suburbanization of the country, the federal government required builders and developers to discriminate in the sale of their housing. Those builders and developers, while they were required to do it, they benefited from those policies and they implemented them and made them happen. And so they have a role to play in remedying segregation as well. Same with realtors, same with banks. And we give a lot of ideas in Just Action of what a community group can advocate that those institutions and companies in our communities do to begin to remedy segregation. Many of these companies in 2020, when we had a racial reckoning in the country after George Floyd's murder, that many of these companies have now, maybe they've taken them down at this point, but they had stuff on their websites about, hiring diversity, equity, and inclusion officers and denouncing racism and promising to, do better. And so this is a way that we can hold them to account to do that by actually taking action. And some ideas that we put forth in the book are, realtors have often, for a long time, supported the policies that maintained and created segregation. They, the California Realtor Association opposed the Fair Housing Act and the California Fair Housing Act. So they were not on the side of promoting integration and racial equality. And so the real estate industry has a lot to make up for. And they could do that by, realtors donating just a fraction of a % of their commissions towards, say, a down payment assistance program that helps African Americans with down payments to buy homes. The California Real Estate Association does have a fund like that. It is out of money right now, as I understand it. So realtors could contribute to that to help ensure that it has the funds it needs to continue to give these down payment assistance grants and loans. Realtors could, like law firms, often have a pro bono part of their practice where they provide free legal representation to lower income or nonprofit clients. Realtor associations could do the same thing, require realtors to do a certain percentage of their practice pro bono, and that could be to represent buyers and sellers who are African American, who have historically been discriminated against by the realtor industry. There's also a lot realtors can do to ensure that they're not continuing to racially steer clients to same-race communities, which they continue to do even though it's outlawed by the Fair Housing Administration, Fair Housing Act. We write about in Just Action in 2019, there was an expose in the Long Island Newsday, and they sent testers to realtors throughout Long Island wearing little pinhole cameras, and they were of different races but the same economic, financial qualifications to see how they were treated by realtors. And the discrimination, the different treatment was staggering. It was, they were steered to communities. One prospective home buyer would be told this community is great for your family, and another would be told, oh, you don't want to live here, it's not safe, and all purely by race. And this was in 2019. And there's no reason to think that Long Island's realtors are different from realtors elsewhere. So realtors need to be continuing to test, realtor associations need to be continuing to test their realtors and then following up with actions when they find that racial steering is occurring. So that's the realtor industry. Banks can provide down payment assistance, like I mentioned, the special purpose credit program. They can provide race-specific down payment assistance programs, and often they need some community pressure to do that. Banks are required to invest in the lower and moderate income neighborhoods within their broader service area. And that's a requirement under the Community Reinvestment Act that was passed in 1977. So banks are rated on how well they do that. And while there's great inflation for the Community Reinvestment Act and most banks do well on the ratings, when banks want to acquire other banks, which happens a lot more often than you would imagine, they need federal regulatory approval to to do that acquisition or merger. And in that process, the federal regulators take community input and public comment on the bank's performance under the Community Reinvestment Act. So a lot of locally organized groups, they oppose a bank merger or acquisition because the bank isn't adequately serving the lower and moderate income communities in their service area, and through that opposition, they can get what are called community benefit agreements from banks, where banks agree to provide more mortgage lending, affordable housing financing, small business lending, open more bank branches in the segregated, previously redlined communities in their service areas. So this is another example of, there's authority, there's sort of like the broad goal in government policy, but it takes organized residents to ensure that those goals are actually followed through with by the banks and the federal regulators. Those are a few ideas. There's a lot more.
So to sort of kick off our questions and answers, Leah, what advice do you have for people who want to get involved, want to do the right thing, but just aren't quite sure where to start? And in particular, working in multiracial coalition, what can we do, particularly as a predominantly, but certainly not exclusively, thank you, white audience? What can we do to move this forward?
Yeah, well, our main argument in Just Action is that in order to enact these changes, the local policy changes and institutional programs that we need to remedy segregation, we need an activated civil rights movement made up of local groups that are biracial and multi-ethnic, that are educated enough about the issues to know what they mean. You don't have to be experts on any of them. And then advocate for changes in their local communities. So that has to begin by talking to your neighbors and building relationships with people from other race parts of your community, and just starting to educate yourselves about how we came to look the way we do as a community, how our communities come to be segregated. I think it's really an important piece that a lot of the groups we write about in Just Action started by researching and inventorying the restrictive covenants in their communities, and understanding that the segregation of their community was intentional. It wasn't just an accident that it looks the way it does, or that, I was lucky enough to live here, or I was, good enough to be able to afford to live here, but that it was intentional policy that allowed, that created our community to look the way it does. Once we see that it was intentional, the creation of segregation, we can start to see that intentional action can begin to undo it. So I think starting by just sort of making this a regular part of the conversation you have with your neighbors, starting groups to be educated and activated around these issues, and then I think there's a lot of groups already working on these issues that are on the flyers on your seats, so engaging with those groups. And what we, I often get in these talks, what's the one thing we should do, or how should we start? And we were very clear in writing Just Action that we can't say how any community should begin to work on these issues, or what the one thing will be that will have the biggest impact, because there were a lot of pieces that went into creating segregation. So there's going to be a lot of pieces that go into undoing it and challenging it. And it sort of doesn't matter. There isn't one that's the most important. It just matters that we start somewhere and start to do something. So whatever it is that inspires you is the right thing to start with.
Thank you for that great rallying cry. So here's a question. Given the strong support in West Marin for lower income housing, especially for those who work here, many of whom are of Latin heritage, how do we reconcile that advocacy for affordable housing with our also deep concern about preserving hard-won environmental standards and other community supportive regulations that may be sacrificed to attract developers' profit-oriented interests?
Okay. Well, I don't know the specifics of the environmental regulations being asked about. But I would say that allowing and advocating for, promoting, recommending housing where housing already exists in communities that already exist is good for the environment. We need denser communities rather than more sprawl where people have to drive farther to work and that where we have to build more infrastructure to meet that new housing. We should build up where we already live. And so doing that in existing communities makes sense sort of fiscally and in terms of the environmental impact.
So one of the organizations on the flyer is Marin Environmental Housing Collaborative, which tries to point in exactly that direction, that affordable housing is not contrary to sound environment.
Yeah, I think it's a real shame that that has become a tension between the environmentalists and affordable housing advocates, that they come to think that they're on opposite sides, that they oppose each other. And I think this is not just here, but everywhere. We write about in Just Action, we write about Minneapolis was the first city to outlaw single-family only zoning. And then it went to court and they were sued by the Sierra Club, saying that allowing more denser housing would be a bad impact on the environment, and so it should be stopped. Similarly, when California got rid of single-family only zoning, required the 4 units, or allowed 4 units per lot, like I mentioned before, I think it was Mountain View, said that they couldn't do that because they were mountain lion habitat. So they were sued by the Attorney General, which is good, but yeah, this sort of tension between environmentalists and advocates for housing is, it's not helping. And I think seeing the larger picture where we need more housing. So where is it going to be? And what's the smallest impact we can have on the environment is making denser communities and building where we already live.
This question is affordable housing income qualification is usually based on some percentage of the local mean income. As some of our communities get wealthier, the percentage could qualify someone earning $80,000 for affordable housing. Can that formula be changed?
Generally, no. So this question is referring to is for most government-subsidized affordable housing, the affordability levels are set by the percent of area median income. And that's because, affordable housing here, what's affordable to a family in Marin is different than what's affordable to a family in Montgomery, Alabama. Our local economies are different. And so a low-income family here earns a lot more than a low-income family elsewhere. And so the housing affordability levels that are subsidized by different government programs are set at percent of area median income. So low-income housing is 80% of area median income, very low is 50%, and extremely low is 30%. So it's true that if you build only low-income housing at 80% of area median income, then families that earn 30% of area median income, extremely low-income households, that low-income housing is still too expensive for them. And so that's why our communities need to build a range of housing affordability. So extremely low, very low, and low, which is why I think a good aspect of the changes in the inclusionary zoning law is that it creates a spread and tries to incentivize building at different levels of affordability. And that's important to do because just because something is low-income housing doesn't mean it's affordable to all of the lower-income residents in our community, so we have to be mindful of that. Do you want to hear about Section 8?
Sure.
Tell
us about Section 8 vouchers, yes.
So Section 8 vouchers or housing choice vouchers is, aside from subsidizing building affordable housing, the federal government provides vouchers to low-income families through the Section 8 program. It's funded through the federal government and administered by local public housing authorities. So low-income families will get a voucher that helps them pay their rent, and that voucher is supposed to allow them to live anywhere in the community of the jurisdiction of their public housing authority. Right, it's funny, but that was an intention and a promise of the Section 8 program, that because the benefit isn't tied to a building in a community, in a neighborhood, it's mobile, it can be used anywhere, that it could allow low-income families to leave high-poverty communities and use their vouchers to live outside of those high-poverty areas. There's lots of reasons why that isn't the case. Only 5% of voucher holders can use their vouchers to live in high-opportunity communities. Those are communities that, have well-resourced schools and access to jobs and good health outcomes. Only 5%, and white voucher holders are more likely to live in these high-opportunity areas than African Americans. One reason is discrimination, plain and simple. It's an allowed form of discrimination by the federal government, outlawed by California. To discriminate against a tenant because they use Section 8. But many landlords still do, and that's because, outlawing discrimination is just one part of the puzzle. We then have to enforce the law. We can do that through testing. Like I mentioned, the realtors in Long Island were tested. Landlords can be tested to see if they're discriminating, not only by race, but by Section 8 status. It's the only way we can really know where this is occurring, unless landlords write in the ads, no Section 8, which they also do, even though it's illegal. And so fair housing organizations and civil rights organizations are the ones that are tasked with finding that discrimination and then trying to eradicate it. So those organizations could use our support. We could volunteer as testers or help those organizations with resources. Another piece of the puzzle is that the voucher amount, so a low-income family who receives a Section 8 voucher pays 30% of their monthly income on their rent, and the voucher pays the difference. So no matter what they make, even if it's very, very little, they pay 30% of that, and the voucher pays the difference up to a maximum voucher amount. Now that maximum voucher amount is set to be 40% of the median rent of an entire metropolitan area. So if you take the whole, I'm not sure where Marin is, it in the San Francisco metro area? So you take the lowest rent in the San Francisco metro area and the highest rent in the metro area, and then you go to the middle one. 10% below that is the maximum amount a voucher will pay for rent. So what does that mean? 60% of the rents in the whole metropolitan area are too expensive for voucher holders to afford. So it's not surprising that they can't use their vouchers to live in higher opportunity areas that are usually more expensive areas. So often, going back to the affordable housing area median income, often those 80% low-income units that are subsidized to be low-income are occupied by families who also use a Section 8 voucher to help pay the rent, because they don't make enough to pay the 80% rent, but the voucher helps them pay the difference. So these are sort of doubly subsidized units. There's an argument about if this is the best way for public funds to be used, is this the most efficient way to meet our affordable housing needs? But this is how it often works. Now the maximum voucher amount issue is also something that can be changed locally. So there are many housing authorities around the country, 24 metropolitan areas, that are required to use a different calculation for determining their maximum rent that's based on small areas. They're called small area fair market rents. So you take a zip code and take the median rent of that zip code or group of zip codes, and that's how much the voucher will pay in that area, and it'll be different in this area. Makes sense. The voucher will pay higher rents in higher cost areas and lower rents in lower cost areas. And it allows voucher holders the ability to move out of high poverty areas. But so the San Francisco Bay Area is not one of the regions that's required to use these small area rent standards. But local housing authorities can do it voluntarily, and many do. They adopt these small area rent standards voluntarily, either jurisdiction-wide or for very high-cost parts of their jurisdiction, to allow voucher holders the ability to move to those areas. So this is another thing we could do as organized residents of our community to advocate, work with our local housing authorities to change their administrative procedures and the calculations they use that have huge impacts on where these low-income families can find housing.
So here's an issue close to the heart of many people here. Do you think Airbnb and other short-term vacation rentals are creating a housing shortage for working families and contributing to more housing segregation?
I have not got that question before. I think taking housing off the market to be occupied by long-term residents, yes, it does reduce the housing supply for all types of people in our community. I don't know that I have a position on Airbnb policies, but short-term rental policies. I would say that the bigger, Airbnb is probably a very big issue here. A big issue all across the country is institutional investors buying up single-family homes, taking them off the market, and turning them into rentals, and basically taking huge amounts of starter home properties out of the ability of people to buy them, and then they become rentals with out-of-town corporate landlords that don't maintain the homes, and it's impossible to know even who they are sometimes because they're owned by these complicated corporate entities. This is a huge issue across the country. It's definitely contributing to our housing shortage and housing affordability problems. And I have just started to hear about some different approaches. Now, I have this idea. I don't know if it's feasible yet. I just keep talking about it until someone will tell me if it is or not legally. But, like an inclusionary zoning ordinance that requires developers to build a certain percentage of their units as affordable. If there's a institutional investor that owns over a certain number of units in a jurisdiction, maybe they have to be required to provide a certain percent of those at affordable prices or sell them at affordable prices rather than turn them into rentals. There's also, I just heard of a bill on the federal level that would, any institutional or any owner of more than 50 rental properties no longer gets to deduct interest deductions and depreciation on those properties. Now, yeah, that's a great idea. It's a way to limit these massive institutional investors. Again, it's a federal bill. We've seen what's happening on the federal level right now. They can't even keep the government open, so I'm not sure that we will get that passed on the federal level, but it's a good idea, and it's something we can start to sort of think through what we could do locally to begin to address this issue, because we have to figure out something, because it's a problem everywhere.
So on that note of encouraging us all to think outside the box and to really, I just want to say personally, this whole issue of where we live and where people can freely live any place by choice. All of us in West Marin, we all say to each other, we wake up every morning and give great gratitude for this incredibly beautiful place in which we live. And that should be true for everyone who lives in this country, everyone who lives in the world. They should have a decent place to live. It is a human right, and it should be a place that is not limited by economic means or racial bigotry, if you will, and not just racial bigotry, but institutional racism. That shouldn't be the limiting factor. And so, Leah, I really want to thank you for inspiring us to challenge housing segregation, to figure out things that we can do to fix it, and to believe that, in fact, we can do something. This was intentionally created, and we can intentionally undo it. I want to say thank you again to Point Reyes Books, for KWMR, and for Main Street Moms, and all of the wonderful volunteers who made this possible. Copies of Just Action and Color of Law are still on sale in the lobby. Leah will be available there for book signing. And please make sure we have your email so that we can stay in touch and move forward. And again, I want to thank everybody for coming. Thank you for caring about this issue. Thank you for caring about all our neighbors and how each of us individually and collectively live in place. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.